Well, happy Wednesday there, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show. Yes, thank you for joining us on another fun-filled episode. Of course, I am your humble host, and thank you for joining us today. Now, first and foremost, did you miss yesterday's episode of The Brian Nichols Show? Don't forget, we are daily, 7 days a week. Make sure you hit that notification button so you're not missing a single episode because it's 7 days a week. It's a lot. But going back to yesterday, Jeremy Todd, you had another phenomenal sales solo episode, and you learned how chocolate cake could make you better at sales. I promise. Go listen to yesterday's episode. Jeremy knocks it absolutely out of the park. But going on to today's episode, yes, we're here to talk to the one and only Kerry McDonald. Now, she is joining the program to outline specifically the things we've talked about with Tiffany Justice, Corey DeAngelis, and the other folks fighting the good fight as it pertains to education policy and looking at the 5 million plus kids who have been pulled out of the public schools in the past year. Kerry digs into, number one, what's happening with all these mandates taking place right now across the United States and the direct implications of those mandates on the kids. Number two, the long-term behavioral outcomes of kids and their development, not being able to see people's faces, especially younger children. What is the long-term implications there? And three, what's happening right now with all these kids getting out of the school system? I know I mentioned 5 million. What do the prospects, though, look like for all these kids heading down the line? Will we be seeing more people leave the schooling systems as we move forward? You have to listen to today's episode. So, with that being said, on to the show. Kerry McDonald here on The Brian Nichols Show. All right, and with that, joining me here on The Brian Nichols Show, you know her from Fee, Kerry McDonald. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
It's great to be with you, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Kerry, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. I know we had you scheduled a couple of weeks back, but you, like millions of other Americans, you got hit in your household with the dreaded coronavirus, but thankfully it didn't hit you too hard because, as we were talking beforehand, it was mostly your kids, and your kids, they fought right through it, as are the millions of other kids with it. And this is why we need to have this conversation today, because the numbers of folks out there who are at an all-time level 10 intensity paranoia level, that the kids are going to be dying en masse. I'm seeing it on social media. I can almost guarantee you're seeing it, as are the thousands of folks who are listening with us today. So let's talk to some of those folks out there who they're trying to combat that hysteria, Kerry. But first, before we go there, let's introduce yourself to the Brian Nichols Show audience. They can see here on the YouTube channel, you're a senior fellow at Fee, but also what got you specifically looking at these issues as it pertains not just to the parental rights, but the rights of the kids themselves, Kerry?
Yeah, I'm great to be with you, Brian. I'm a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, which is the country's oldest libertarian think tank, founded in 1946, celebrating our 75th year anniversary this year. I'm also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and I write frequently at Forbes on education policy issues. And I'm the author, most recently, of the book Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that was published in 2019, but it's actually gained quite a bit of interest and popularity over the past year and a half, as so many families have been really looking for other education options beyond their assigned government school in the wake of school shutdowns and various pandemic policies that continue to really make an impact on school even this year, when we thought that things were sort of calming down and schools were reopening for full-time in-person learning. It's these mask wars and now new vaccine mandates for students that I think we'll talk about are really having parents think differently about how their kids are educated.
Yeah, and it's funny, Kerry. I'm hearing it from a lot of people who they got their first vaccine. And well, I say the first vaccine. They got the vaccinated in the first kind of like round of people when they started to have the uptick in vaccinations. And really the mentality, as I've been having a conversation with them, has been, I kind of thought I was going to get my life back. I thought that with the vaccine, that would kind of be the gateway into some normality, because at that point, now I am protected with the vaccine. And then, I can make the choice. I mean, you're seeing right now, even the Delta variant, even if you do get one of those breakthrough cases, your chance of having some type of catastrophic outcome are just, of the absolute minutia. So it's one of those situations where if you've had the chance to get vaccinated, you have that opportunity, and you likely have. And if you've not gotten vaccinated, you're probably not going to. So we see right now, well, I say we even saw back then, that was kind of the turning point. I thought, okay, this is the moment we can kind of go back to some type of real life. And now we see, that's not the case. And I'm seeing a lot of people who, to the point you were saying before, they were kind of okay with, okay, well, we're going to be protecting, the kids, we're being rational, but now things aren't making sense. We're seeing the hysteria just start to blow out of proportion. So let's start off with, probably the most draconian approach that we've seen, and that is LA, the largest school district in the United States, requiring how old kids to get vaccinated if they want to go to school, Kerry?
Yeah, the vaccine is currently approved only for kids 12 and older, and LA is the country's second largest school district, but the first major school district to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine for all eligible students, at this point, ages 12 and older. And this happened last Thursday. The school board voted unanimously. One board member recused himself because he's a Pfizer board member. But other than that, the entire school board voted to implement this coercion on what amounts to about 460,000 students. There's about 600,000 in the overall district, 460,000 12 and older that are now mandated to get this vaccine. They have to do that by the end of the calendar year, or participate in district-run remote schooling. If they participate in sports or other extracurricular activities, the students have until the end of October to be fully vaccinated. And, one of the things I mentioned, you have here on the screen, my most recent fee.org article about this topic. One of the things, thankfully, that's been really, I think, a saving grace with COVID is that it largely spares children. And I can speak to that, as you mentioned, from personal experience. My son brought COVID home from summer camp this summer, and it had hit my 4 kids and was, honestly, the most mild thing that I think they've ever had. They had like a 99-degree fever and a headache for 24 hours. So, in the realm of colds and viruses that they've had in their childhood, this was, really probably the most mild one that they've ever had, thankfully. And that's true for the vast majority of kids. In fact, Professor Marty McCary at Johns Hopkins University has done research showing that, of the very small number of young people, of children who died of COVID in 2020, most of them, I think all of them, he said, had significant underlying conditions. So 0 healthy children, according to Marty McCary. This was written up in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago. 0 healthy children died from COVID last year in his sample. And even kids who had asthma or other, conditions that might typically make a respiratory illness problematic, thankfully, were not impacted heavily by COVID. So really, he said that the kids that died, had things like leukemia or, significant congenital underlying conditions that exacerbated their condition. And even then, data show that the seasonal flu killed more children in 2020 than COVID. So any death of a child is of course tragic. But when we're looking at these policies, we're not mandating the flu vaccine in most school districts. And yet it seems that it's now reasonable for these school districts to propose coercing parents to give their kids the COVID vaccine. And certainly parents are outraged, many, rightfully so. Many parents are speaking out against this and saying that that the data just don't support the coercion underlying these mandates. In fact, one of the things that I mentioned in this fee.org article about the Los Angeles schools mandating the vaccine is this came at the same time that a new medical preprint study in the US came out last week showing that children, especially young boys, are 6 times more likely to end up with a cardiac adverse event, such as myocarditis, from the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, than are to be hospitalized for a natural infection with COVID. So 6 times more likely.
Wow.
And it's just, and of course, both thankfully are extremely rare. But if we're again comparing risks and benefits, it's more likely, particularly for young boys, that they would have an adverse reaction from the vaccine than they would being hospitalized with COVID. And I think this is what a lot of medical professionals, physicians are pointing out. So last week, Scientific Advisory Board in the UK came out recommending against vaccination of children 12 and older, saying that, again, the benefits don't outweigh the risks. And they pointed out that they were concerned with some of these myocarditis and cardiac adverse events that were occurring in young children.
Wow. Well, and this is the thing I think we hear a lot from the folks who are scared is that, well, Kerry, we just don't know what we just don't know. And yet there are things we can look at and say, well, listen, your fears of the unknown, we have fears of the known. And the fears we're having right now are the direct impact of, number one, these lockdowns, but number two, just the restrictive mandates and regulations you're putting on kids. What is this going to do to kids right now? We're seeing depression rates skyrocket. We have substance abuse skyrocketing, and not even mentioning the behavioral aspects of kids trying to learn, just looking at faces, smiling,
Right.
Small children. There's so much right now that's holding them back in this society. And what are we going to see right now from that direct negative consequence? And I think we're starting to have a lot of parents say enough. Like,
Right.
my kids, they're not a thing to be toyed around with. You can't just put their lives on pause. We can't do that. And to your point, we're not mandating vaccinations for the normal flu for kids, despite it actually ending up killing more kids. I mean, that's mind-blowing that that's the actual stat. And yet here we are having this conversation. Kerry, I'm scared sometimes because I think, how can we have something just so obvious, just so, just plainly obvious, that the hyperness that's been focused on just getting people scared, like almost a fear porn of sorts, that has been the driving narrative. And there are so many people who buy this narrative, hook, line, sinker. What are we missing with these folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a couple really good points. The first really is that the government response to the coronavirus will shape this young generation in profound ways. I think in a lot of negative ways, and we won't really see the full implication of these lockdown policies, the social isolation, the mask wearing, and so on these kids, potentially for decades. We're starting to see, as you suggest, that mental health has deteriorated, particularly the studies that came out in 2020 showing that during the various rounds of lockdowns, suicidal ideation went up dramatically, that hospital admissions for suicidal ideation were increasing at a rapid rate, higher than previous years when they were already increasing prior to the pandemic, and this just exacerbated it. And overall, just feelings of anxiety, depression, anything that would really result from being disconnected from our social networks, from the people, places, and things around us. This was certainly felt by adults as well, but really had, I think, a profound impact on kids who really bore the brunt of these lockdown policies, despite, again, thankfully not being seriously harmed generally from COVID. And, it's really heartbreaking to think about this. Some of it, of course, we can attribute to school closures that separated kids from their communities. But I think it wasn't really so much the fact that kids weren't in school, it's that they were completely disconnected from their peers. They weren't able to interact with their friends. They weren't able to do fun things together, participate in sports and extracurricular activities, or go to public places. So it was really that kind of impact, that sort of separation from their larger communities, that I think has really led to this problem. And now, we see this continuing into this fall with mandatory mask wearing in many school districts across the country. Babies now, young, not so much babies, but young children masking, I think, ages 2 and up. And in fact, one of the things that I thought was, just most sort of indicative, I suppose, of the constantly changing narrative from these quote unquote experts came from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that came out basically saying, well, it's okay that young children don't see facial expressions. They don't really need to. That's sort of overrated. And of course, as any parent knows, this is how children learn, how young children build those kinds of social connections, build relationships, kind of become more familiar with the world around them, is through these nonverbal cues that they're now being distanced from. And so, there's just so much that we've done to children, we've done to teenagers and young adults. And I think, again, we won't really see the true impact of these policies for another decade or two.
I don't mean to be that guy, but we have to look at the headlines here, because we're recording on Monday. This episode is going to be airing on Wednesday. And the headlines today were the generation, and I would say we're going to talk about the older kids, right? The kids in college. What were they chanting this past weekend at all these college football games? F Joe Biden everywhere. And it struck me. You're hearing these just ginormous 100,000 plus stadiums of Gen Zers just chanting F Joe Biden in, pretty much unanimously. And it's pretty loud. I mean, it's actually kind of shocking. And I'm actually like kind of inspired, if I can say that, because I didn't expect that from Gen Z. I honestly didn't, especially with it being a Democrat president. But I think, and I said this to one of my employees, because he'd asked me, because he knows I'm pretty into the loop with stuff. He's like, he's getting nervous about seeing all these restrictions starting to come back into place. And he's like, do you think they'll lock down again, Brian? And I said, you know what? Damn it all, I hope they do. And he's like, what? And I was like, because you need to get mad. Like, you need to see the pain and feel the pain and actually act on it. It can't just be enough for you to be annoyed. You have to actually get angry. And seeing this past weekend, and I think this is in direct response to how a lot of colleges, I just had last week, Trent Ortner, they're doing a big protest with Young Americans for Liberty and Students for Liberty back actually coming up here in October 11th, I believe. It's a national-wide day of protest against all these crazy mandates that colleges are going to be doing to these kids, like not giving you Wi-Fi if you're not vaccinated. That was an actual story of what these colleges are going to be doing. So I think you're starting to see a lot of people pushing back, and let's now bring that down to the high school, middle school, elementary school level. We saw this past year, I would say, some of the largest numbers of parents getting their kids out of the monopoly of the public schooling system and saying, you know what? No, we're going to start either A, just finding other solutions, or B, supporting, funding students and not systems, the school choice mentality, looking at what, really Corey DeAngelis has been doing so well. So that is inspiring. Let's talk about that though, Kerry. What has been in your world, and you're talking to parents and such, the direct reason for them wanting to bring their kids out of schools? And then what are they doing in response to, they have them out of schools? Where are they now going in return?
Right. So a couple of things. First, I'll respond to your note about college football games. It's encouraging to hear college students finally finding their voice and pushing back against these policies. I think you're right that some of it has to do with the vaccination policies on campus, but a lot of it is that many of these colleges have just gone so far beyond any kind of reasonable pandemic control measures that students are finally waking up and saying, this makes absolutely no sense. I mean, I think of, for example, Amherst College out in Western Massachusetts. Not only do they require mandatory vaccination for all students and staff, but they were also coming out saying you had to be fully masked, you had to be social distance, there was no cafeteria time, there were no opportunities for kind of in-person socialization. And I think a lot of kids are just saying, come on, you know,
Right.
we've jumped through all of your hoops, enough is enough now. So it is encouraging again to hear that maybe the tide is turning and that college students can lead some of these protests. That's good to hear. And I think it's a good sign, you know, that maybe college students can kind of reclaim liberty and start to realize that government has overstepped its bounds, far overstepped its bounds over the past 18 months. And it's up to kind of this rising generation to begin to appreciate the ideals of individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and prosperity. So that is encouraging. Now, in terms of K-12, which is sort of my area of focus in education, there really has been a mass exodus from government schools over the past year. Nationwide, public school districts lost 3% on average of their student body. That was either families switching over to private schools or parochial schools that were more likely to reopen for full-time in-person learning than government schools were, or they switched over to homeschooling, or they delayed school entry for young kids. What we saw really was that homeschooling doubled, according to the most recent U.S. Census Bureau data that came out in February. Homeschooling doubled in 2020 alone to now more than 5 million students, or more than 11% of the overall U.S. K-12 school-age population being homeschooled. And the largest driver of that homeschooling growth last year came from Black homeschooling families that experienced a 5-fold increase in homeschooling numbers in 2020 and are now overrepresented in the national homeschooling population compared to their representation in the public school student body. So
really quick, Kerry, I'm so sorry. I have to interrupt because rewind about 3 years ago, I forget. I got into I wouldn't say an argument, a very passionate discussion, we'll say that, with a very dear friend, and they work in the public schooling system. And they were, you know, appalled that I would support school choice. And one of the main reasons was because, Brian, it's racist. And oh my God, like the fact that that number 5 times, it's huge, Kerry. And the fact that they're now that you have Black Americans now overrepresenting versus that's phenomenal, because that completely destroys that argument and shows when it comes to actually like looking at where the students are going to be getting the most value, parents know best, and they're taking advantage of it. I didn't mean to interrupt. Please, sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So now in the U.S. homeschooling population, more than 16% of the U.S. homeschool population identifies as Black, and that compares to about 15% in the K-12 public school population. So overrepresented. And overall, the current homeschooling population is really reflective of the overall U.S. population, demographically, geographically, socioeconomically, ideologically. It's as diverse in the homeschooling population as our kind of larger American population is. So much growth there. And you're absolutely right that in addition to this growth in homeschooling and in looking at private education options and the kind of exodus from government schools, there's been growing parental support and taxpayer support for school choice policies. In fact, the record high numbers, according to the most recent Real Clear Opinion Research polling, showing more than 70% of taxpayers support school funding following the child instead of funding these bureaucratic school systems that have just not at all met parents' needs, certainly over the last 18 months. So, you know, in that way, I think that there are some silver linings. I'll say another silver lining in the way of education that I think has come to light over the past 18 months is the tremendous growth in education entrepreneurship. So as parents really, I think, got a close-up look through district Zoom schooling back in the spring of 2020 at what was happening in their kids' schools, and a lot of what they saw they didn't like, they started to realize that there might be other ways their kids could be educated. And we saw the rise of pandemic pods, or these learning pods that kind of sprouted in 2020, and was really a takeoff of the kind of micro school movement that had been gaining traction prior to the pandemic. And that has continued to accelerate over the past year and a half. And a lot of companies have begun to sprout to support that model. So for example, I think of a company called GetSchoolhouse.com that connects families that want to create this sort of multi-family, multi-age learning pod or home-based micro school for their kids. And they'll connect those families with a certified teacher to lead these pods. And they just raised over $8 million in venture capital funding as a startup in April of this year. So there's, I think a lot of growth. I just wrote recently at Forbes last week about another company called KaiPod Learning, which is based here in Boston, where I am. They're currently participating in the prestigious Y Combinator Startup Accelerator program. So they're on path to receive some really great startup funding. And they do the same kind of thing of bringing kids together in these multi-age spaces, physical spaces, to learn together and have adults facilitating, but in a kind of private, affordable, out-of-school learning model.
I was writing down notes because that 70% number, we have to really focus on that, because if 70% of parents support funding students, not systems, and we see that this educational entrepreneurship, which I love that term, by the way, that is a growing area, that it just reinforces the idea of why, candidly, we're doing what we're doing here in the program, and that is solutions-based sales. It wins. And the reason it wins is because instead of having to convince people that your ideas are right, you just simply show them the outcomes. You say, look at what we're doing. Do you want to take part in this? Do you want to have the opportunity to have your kid have the best education possible? And every parent's going to say, of course. And instead of saying, well, okay, do you want to support your school here in the public schooling mentality and you support your teachers? Instead, now we're just giving the parents the power to go ahead and make sure that money's following their students directly. That's a different argument. It's not even an argument at that point. Now it's just a matter of saying, this just makes sense. And the best type of sales, Kerry, this is why, I again wanted to make sure we did this type of approach here in the show. The best type of sales is when you don't even feel you're being sold to. You just feel that the person that you're talking to is helping you along the journey. And really, it just makes sense. That's the end of the day. It just makes sense. So let's do this. As we go towards the tail end of the conversation, I want to give you the final platform, Kerry. What would you want folks to take away from the conversation today as it pertains to not just looking at funding students and systems, but truly looking at the impact of the kids? That's for the past year and a half plus, going into question mark into the future. What should we be taking away here?
Yeah, a couple things. I'll just respond to what you were just mentioning earlier about the growth in support for school choice policies. We've seen many states over the past year implement or expand various school choice policies at the state level. And I think it really makes a lot of sense because EdChoice has done some really great surveying, for example, on what parents want from their child's education. And they found that while about 80% of kids attend an assigned government school, only about a third of their parents would prefer them there. So there is this enormous choice gap between where kids are currently being educated and what their parents actually want and prefer for their education. And I think a lot of education entrepreneurs are recognizing this gap and are rising to the challenge to meet that demand for schooling alternatives and other kinds of innovative learning models. So I'm really excited about that. I really think that this could be a transformational moment in American education where more and more families realize they have other options that are accessible, that are affordable beyond an assigned district school, and they are increasingly opting out of those government schools. Go back to kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of the show of Los Angeles implementing their vaccine mandate. Interestingly enough, California had last year an overall statewide exodus from district schools of 3%, right around the national average. But Los Angeles public schools had the state's largest exodus from their district schools last year, 4.8% decline in public school enrollment. And so I think now that you're seeing this vaccine mandate for COVID come in for LA students, it will be interesting to see how many more parents will flee that system.
Kerry McDonald, the book is Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. You can go ahead and find it over on Amazon. We'll make sure we include that link in the show notes. And folks, of course, go ahead, just click the little podcast artwork. It brings you right to the Brian Nichols Show website. Not only can you find today's episode with the show notes, but the entire transcript of the episode, as well as Kerry's bio, along with all of her links as well. With that being said, Kerry McDonald, thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Brian Nichols Show.
Oh, thanks again, Brian. Appreciate it.
Alrighty, folks, that's going to wrap up our conversation with Kerry McDonald. Told you it was a good one, so do me a favor. Make sure you go ahead and share today's episode. And when you do, make sure you give Kerry a tag. And also, please be sure to give yours truly a tag as well at B Nichols Liberty. Other than that being said, folks, that's all I have for you today. Coming up here tomorrow on Thursday, Jeremy Todd returns to the program. Another sales solo short with you, the audience. So make sure you strap in. You're going to class, folks. With that being said, thanks for joining us here on today's Brian Nichols Show. It's Brian Nichols signing off for Kerry McDonald. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.